think it's time to get started. Now, as this is the last lecture, I should say a few words by way of thanks to my very nice hosts here at Hang Seng, and especially to Gilbert Fong and to Esther and the whole team here. They are such a happy crowd. I'm always very happy to be here, and in fact quite sad to be leaving tomorrow. But you know, life has to go on. And just it's been a wonderful 3 weeks I've had in Hong Kong. Unfortunately, about 1 week was spent in hospital, but that wasn't their fault. That was my fault. And I was very well looked after. Sorry, that meant I had to cancel one of my lectures. But now we come to the last lecture, and several people said to me, "But John, why are you talking about modern poetry? You never talk about modern poetry." It's true, I don't very often. I thought it was time I did something about modern poetry. But as we go through the lecture, you'll see I have very mixed feelings about modern Chinese poetry. And I called the lecture Dancing in Chains. And I've explained in my notes why I've called it Dancing in Chains is a very old expression to talk about translating poetry, because the chains, in the traditional meaning of that word, of that expression, the chains are supposed to represent the formal attributes of poetry, like the sonnet or the jieju or the lüshi, and then you have to try and make them come alive despite the rules. Now, I'm giving that expression a new meaning. I'm turning it on its head, because for me, in the modern era, since basically the fourth movement, since the Wusi Yundong, the chains have been the chains of politics and social pressure. 20th century Chinese writers and 20th century poets and 20th century translators have suffered under the pressure of political circumstances. Those are the chains that have bound them. And as I say in my notes, despite the pressure, despite the chains, some have managed to dance. You know, dancing in this sense is a metaphor for freedom, for creativity, for enjoying what you do, for self-expression. So basically, dancing in chains means two things here. One is that modern poets have managed to dance despite the chains of being modern and being subject to political pressure. And some translators have managed also to dance, to be free, to be creative, despite the social and political pressures. So that's the basic message I'm trying to communicate today. It's true, I don't have a great deal of time for modern Chinese poetry. I'll be completely frank with you. I think when you could, as a translator, if I could spend a week translating one Tang poem, I'd rather do that than translate 100 pages of modern Chinese poetry. I think in terms of quality, you get more out of a single Tang poem by I don't really mind who it's by, you know, could be Li Bo, Du Fu, Du Mu is one of my favorites, you know, Bo Zhi, they're all wonderful, you know, and they were using classical Chinese, literary Chinese, which is one of the great inventions of the human race, you know, whereas Bai Hua Wen is just a feeble shadow, you know, of, I mean, one of the great problems with the May the 4th movement was that they thought they could replace Wen Yan with Bai Hua Wen, and of course they couldn't. I mean, they've suffered from that ever since. So they've been using a second-rate medium to write poetry, and it's evident in every poem written in the 20th century. So that's my basic point of view. However, in amongst all that, there are some interesting things, and they provide interesting challenges for the translator, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So if you'll bear with me, I'll do what I usually do, which is to talk to the PowerPoint, and I'm going to begin with the very first example I have, which is a very early anthology of, they just call it Xiandai Shixuan, a very early anthology of translations, which came out in the 1930s. And the two people responsible for it, and there's the title page. the two people responsible were Harold Acton and Chen Shixiang, and they met each other in Peking. I'm afraid you'll have to get used to me calling the place Peking, because I have very serious objections to calling it Beijing. You know, it's always been called Peking since the 18th century, and nobody's going to change the English language, you know, for me. So anyway, they worked together in Peking, and in their anthology they had a wonderful selection of the poets who were coming to prominence in the 1930s, and one of them was, of course, the great Chen Mengjia. Chen Mengjia came to a very sad end. One of the reasons he got into such trouble, and one of the reasons why I respect Chen Mengjia so much, is that he fiercely opposed the idea of Jiantizi. You know, Jiantizi for him was destroying the Chinese language, and I think he was absolutely right. Anyway, I'm going to look at one of his poems as they try. Here, the poem I'm going to look at is this one, a very famous poem called Yi Duo Ye Hua. Very short poem by Chen Mengjia. And this is a nice photograph of Chen Shixiang. That's Chen Shixiang there. And this man here was a very famous European art critic called Bernard Berenson. And Chen Mengjia got to know him quite well. And that's a very lovely photograph sorry, did I say Chen Mengjia? I mean Chen Shixiang, sorry. Chen Shixiang got to know him very well, probably through Harold Acton. And in fact, Chen Shixiang and Harold Acton also did a translation of the famous Qing Dynasty play, Tao Hua Shan. And here's a photograph of Harold Acton when he was at Beida with all these rather elegant young men. You know, he liked to surround himself with elegant young men. He was actually he was quite openly gay. He was one of those very interesting English intellectuals of the 1920s and 30s who was absolutely uncompromising in stating his preference for homosexual relations. And as a result, he was very happy in Peking because it was very tolerant in those days. And he surrounded himself with beautiful young men. I mean, I'm not saying he did anything wrong, but he was very happy in that circle of people. And many of these, among his great friends was the poet Bian Zhilin, and of course he knew Xu Zhimo and all these people. And he had some very happy years at Beida. And let's see what's happening here. And this is the young Bian Zhilin, one of the great modern poets. And in my opinion, one of the better ones. And he was featured in the anthology that Harold Acton and Chen Shixiang put together. I happen to have, where did I put it? Oh, here we are. I'm very privileged to have one of the rare copies of that anthology. Here it is. If you want to come and look at it in the interval, you're very welcome. It's a very nicely produced book, and a good selection, and quite good translations. Well, that's a poem by Benjamin. We'll look at that in a minute. I'm afraid the order of these... And this is another book that Harold Acton produced in collaboration with another Chinese gentleman called Li Yixie. And these are Ming Xiaoshuo. I think they're mostly Feng Menglong. Again, this is a particularly good translation. Now, this is Harold Acton. He was a real character, you know. This is his Chinese studio. And he liked to dress up in, you know, fancy clothes and surround himself with beautiful Chinese furniture and so on. He came from a very, very wealthy family. He was from a British aristocratic family. And he was also a friend of the great novelist Evelyn Waugh. And if you know the famous novel by Evelyn Waugh called Brideshead Revisited, Harold Acton was the model for the Oxford Don Blanche, you know. And he always called himself an aesthete. In fact, his autobiography is called Memoirs of an Aesthete, because he believed in art for art's sake. You know, he was one of those, frankly, decadent British aristocrats for whom I have a great admiration. And his father, Lord Acton, Harold Acton wrote a very good novel about life in Peking in the 1930s called Peonies and Ponies. It's an excellent novel, very well worth reading. And his family had this most beautiful house outside Florence in Italy, at the Villa La Pietra. In fact, I'm going to Florence in May, and I intend to visit the Acton Villa, because now it's a kind of cultural centre. And it's the most, you can see it, it's a very beautiful place. And there's another part of the garden. And, okay, that's enough about Harold Acton. Well, you see, this is the kind of person he was. And he ended up in Peking during the Ming War, the Republican period. And he taught at Beida, and he got to know all these young poets at a time when, you know, there was still terrible friction between the Kuomintang and the newly established Kuomintang. But basically, this didn't prevent cultural and intellectual life from going on pretty much as it always has done, as it always had done. And Beida was one of the cultural centres, and he happened to end up at Beida. So, if you like, this is the first example of how this translation enterprise was the product of political and social circumstances. If he'd gone there 10 years later, it would have been the Japanese War, and he would have had to go down to Kunming because Beida had all moved down to Sinan Lianda. But at the time he was in China in the 30s, he was able to be in Peking, and he worked in Beida, and he met all these young poets. Now, let's have a look at the very first example, which was the poem by Chen Mengjia. Here we are. I'll let you look at the Chinese. I'm not going to try and read it because I don't have time, but I'll give you. It's a very simple poem. I was just mentioning before this lecture to some friends that when I was at Hong Kong in Chinese University in the 1980s, I was working with a very fine scholar called Stephen Sung Qi, and he was a great friend of the poet Yu Guangzhong, the Taiwanese poet. He died recently, a very, very fine poet. And Yu Guangzhong came in one day with a little book of modern Chinese poetry, and he handed it to Stephen Sung and said, "I've been through all these poems, I've given them grades from A to C." And he couldn't give anything more than B- because they were all quite badly written. Well, not badly written, but just rather poor, you know. And frankly, I would give this maybe B+, or even if it's lucky, I'd give it B+. You see, compared to, say, Li Bo or Du Fu or, you know, any of the great Chinese poets, this is minor stuff, you know, this is lightweight, but it's quite pleasant, you know. So have a look at that, and then we'll look at the Chinese, the English translation by Acton and Chen Shixiang. Of course, Chen Shixiang himself was a very good scholar. He went on to teach at Berkeley, at the University of California, and he was a very fine scholar. He's, of course, no longer alive, but he would have helped Harold Acton a lot. He probably did the first draft, and then Acton came along and polished the English. You see, this is the English. A wild flower opened and faded in the desert, smiled to the sun, this particle of life, perfectly knowing the wisdom God had given him. His joys, his poesy, frolicked on the breeze. A wild flower opened and faded in the desert. He could watch the blue, though blind to his own minuteness. Inured to tender breeze and blast alike, his private dreams were easily forgot. It's a very lightweight poem in English as well. And I think I'd like to point out here that there are certain words which clearly, for me, would have been provided by Harold Acton. For example, you know, the verb inured to. It's not a word that I would expect Chen Shixiang to even know. In fact, I wouldn't even use it much myself. To be inured to something means you're kind of immune to it. You've lost your sensitivity to it. I think this is a particularly weak line. I'm talking here as a translator, you see. As a translator, I'm particularly concerned with each individual word and its particular music, its rhythm, its weight. And the way a wildflower opened and faded in the desert, he he could watch the blue, though blind to his own minuteness. This is such a weak last word in that line. You know, minuteness. It's musically weak. It's a kind of abstract word, which frankly isn't suited. If you look at the Chinese, you know, here we are. If I can get this red thing to work, yeah. 看不见自己的渺小. I mean, it's not a particularly great line in Chinese either, to be honest, but at least it's not as good as minuteness, you know, which is the kind of thing you'd expect from the minutes of a meeting, you know. It's got no sort of, it's got no strength, you know, and the last word of a line must be a carefully chosen word, you see. Anyway, you know, I don't even like this very much. His joys, his poesy, frolicked on the breeze. I'm quite sure Harold Acton put in that word. It's a kind of Harold Acton word, you know. But if you, because Harold Acton was a kind of decadent aesthete, you know. And if you look at here, you know, it just says, it doesn't say poesy. It just says 他的诗, his poetry, his poem, you know. His poem. 他的诗在风前轻扬. Now, I mean, even this verb frolic, you know, it's wrong. It doesn't mean frolic. Frolic is the kind of thing Harold Acton would do with young boys, you know. I mean, it's a sort of, it's a playful word, but actually the Chinese is very plain. It just says, you know, it just says it was a physical wavering, you see, in the breeze. So I have a lot of problems with even this line here, perfectly knowing the wisdom God had given him. You know, 上帝给他的聪明，他自己知道. I mean, it's a very poor translation because actually 聪明 doesn't mean wisdom, you know. We know that. We've got to be, as translators, you know, the essence is the choice of words, you know, le mot juste, the right word. And I mean, I would give Harold Acton B-, you see, and probably Chen Mengjiao B+, maybe just B. But the whole thing is a bit disappointing. You know, if you gave, even a poor translation of a good Tang poem, you know, even like our famous, you know, Wang Wei, Kong Shan Bu Jian Mian. I mean, first of all, the Chinese is A+, right? A+. Let's not mess about here. Wang Wei hardly ever wrote a poem that wasn't at least A, you know. And then the translations are varying from like A- to B-. But I mean, this is just B all the way through, both the original and the translation. I'm sorry to be so depressing, but I have to be honest. Now, we've got a poem by Bian Zhilin. Now, I actually met Bian Zhilin in Hong Kong in the 1980s. He came on a visit, and I was at Hong Kong University at the bar with my great friend Wang Siu Kit, who taught translation there. And he came out and said, John, come in. We've got Bian Zhilin here. And there was Bian Zhilin. He must have been about 90 years old. He looked terribly, terribly thin and old and tired. But I mean, he was a bit of a legend, you know, because I think he was probably a better poet than Chen Mengjia, in the sense that he knew how to handle words. But let's just have a look at this. This is quite a famous poem of his called Gu Zhen de Meng, you know, a dream of an old Zhen. And we have a problem there immediately with the word Zhen, you know. It's a very Chinese word. But have a quick look at the Chinese. I won't read it. You probably all know it because it's in most of the anthologies. I'm afraid this is Jiantizi. I do apologize. I didn't have time to convert it. I hate Jiantizi, you see. I'm just like Chen Mengjia. Looking at Jiantizi actually makes me feel quite ill. But you know, I've been teaching Chinese for so many years. I make my students, they come to me after 3 years of Chinese, and I say, right, first thing is we only use Fantizi. They say, what? I give them a thing in Fantizi. I can't read that. I say, well, you go away and learn how to read it because you're going to have to read it with me. And then after about a month, they come back and they say to me, oh, John, I'm never going to read Jiantizi again because Fantizi is the real thing, you know. And then I said, okay, stage 2. Go and read some classical Chinese now. What? I said, go and read a story by Pu Songling. What? So they go away and they say, we can't read this stuff, it's too hard. I said, try again, and try again. Because, you know, real Chinese is number one, it's Fantizi. Number two, it's Wenyan, right? These are the real treasures of the Chinese language. So I'm sorry about this, it's all Jiantizi because I downloaded it from the internet, you know. And this is the translation from Acton and Chen Shixiang, The Dream of the Old Village. Immediately, we're up against, you know, the problem which bedevils all translators. The Chinese just says, I think it just says 古筝的梦, right? Well, there's no article, there's no definite or indefinite article, right? So immediately English has to sort of decide on whether to say a or the. You know this is the killer. This is what we live with every day, is the fact that English language has to do all these stupid things. And the wonderful thing about good Chinese is that it doesn't have to. It can leave you in suspense. Is it a village? Is it the village? Is it a dream? Is it the dream? And you have to make a choice in English. You can't say old village dream. That's telegram language, you know. So, and is a zhen a village? You know? Zhen is a very special word in Chinese. Chinese has lots of words to describe places, you know. And the same is true in French. There are different kinds of towns and villages which all have different words in French. Some of them mean a fortified village. Some of them mean, you know, a very straggly village. So, you know, just by saying an old village, it's already lost about 50% of its intrinsic value. Anyway, I don't let me get too stuck on that. In the old village, have I got the thing working here? That little red spot is quite hard to find, isn't it? In the old village are two kinds of sound. The one as solitary as the other. During the day, the fortune teller's gong, the watchman's wooden clapper in the night, unable to shiver the dreams of other folk, as in somnambulism. What the hell is that word somnambulism doing there? Again, it sounds like a medical report, you know. I mean, let's go back to the Chinese. And what about this verb to shiver the dreams? I didn't know shiver was an active verb, actually. I thought it was an intransitive. Oh, I'm shivering, you know. I can't shiver you. I'm sorry, but you can't. I've never known anyone use shiver as a transitive verb. I'm being a nuisance, I know, but how do you shiver the dreams? You can shatter the dreams. You can break the dreams. I think the Chinese is summa poor, right? And then, as in somnambulism, let's go back to the Chinese. You see, here we are. I can't read it very clearly. Oh, yeah. 古筝上的有两种声音, right? 一样的地方。白天是算命了。Oh, that we need to go on a bit. Sorry. 敲不破别人的梦. I mean, 作者梦色的. It doesn't talk about somnambulism. Somnambulism is sleepwalking, right? I know about somnambulism because my brother is a sleepwalker. I know what it's like. You're never supposed to wake them up, okay? My brother used to come to the bottom of my bed when we were at boarding school together, and he used to sleepwalk and come to the bottom of my bed and deliver me long lectures about life. And I'd wake up and think, what the hell's going on? And then I suddenly realized he was sleepwalking and sleep-talking, right? It's a very special thing. And you mustn't wake them up. So I just put my arm around him, took him back to bed, tucked him up and said, now go to sleep, you know. And that's somnambulism. It's somna is sleep, and ambula means to walk, right? It's got nothing to do with the Chinese, which simply says, 做着梦色的, just as like in a dream, you know. So why would the translator get into this word somnambulism, you know? I think I know why, because they think it's very impressive, you know. A long word, you know, somnambulism, but totally out of place here. It's not the right word, you know. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit of a nuisance here, but the blind man trudges the street step by step. He knows which stone is lower and which is higher, and the age of the girls in every domicile. What's that word doing there? What's it doing there, domicile? It's the kind of word you get in government reports, you know. Fiscal domicile, that means which country you pay taxes in, you know. It's not the right word, it means each home, you know. I can't even remember the Chinese, but it's certainly not domicile. There's something funny going on here. Maybe Chen Shixiang was trying to impress Harold Acton with his knowledge of certain long words like somnambulism and domicile, or maybe Harold Acton was trying to impress Chen Shixiang. I can't tell you because they're both dead now. But there's something funny going on here. I could do another lecture on collaboration between people, because it's a very interesting topic, the way people collaborate on translations. I've done a lot of it in my life. I've often collaborated with my students. And sometimes it's great fun, you know, and sometimes it's absolute hell. Because, you know, your student doesn't want to accept your advice, and if they do, they always try to pretend it was their idea, or else they try to impress you and they give you the wrong idea. I mean, it's a complicated relationship. It's like a marriage, you know. I won't start talking about marriage today because that's not my topic, okay? And I don't think I know anything about it anyway. I mean, it's a very tricky subject. But a collaboration between two translators is like a marriage. And one of the most successful collaborations in the 20th century was, in fact, a marriage between two very, very dear friends of mine, Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang, his wife. And they lived and breathed translation. It was part of their married life. And they had a wonderful relationship. They always teased each other and you know, made fun of each other's mistakes and so on. But they had a wonderful working relationship. Not everybody does. I think there's something funny going on here between Harold Acton and Chen Shesiang, but we'll have to reserve judgment. Knocking more deeply into the dreams of others as in somnambulism. I mean, we won't go on about that. The watchman paces the street step by step. He knows which stone is lower, which is higher, and of which house the door's most tightly shut. I don't find the grammar there very convincing. I think he's left out a verb. And of which house the doors are most tightly shut would be better. It would be better rhythmically as well. Rhythm is just all important in the translation of poetry. There's nothing more important than rhythm. And rhythm is something that is only really available for judgment by native speakers of English. Very few non-native speakers and writers of English are able to judge the quality of the rhythm of language. It's terribly important. It's rhythm and melody are actually all one when it comes to the spoken word. Because, of course, technically there's no tune in spoken English, but there's a kind of understood melody which is all linked to the rhythm. And that's the qualification for a translator of poetry. I found that very much so when I was translating my last book, which is the Dao De Jing, because really the Dao De Jing is poetry, you know. It's very, very old poetry. And I was all the time trying to find the rhythm for that work in English. I think I did 27 revisions of that book because I wasn't happy with the rhythm of my English until the 27th revision. Even then I wasn't happy, but I mean, I couldn't go on forever. And rhythm is very important. Now this, I'm sorry, but where did he get this idea? Hark ye. I mean, you have to have a register that's consistent. It's midnight, hark ye. Hark ye hasn't been used since about 1770, you know. And suddenly to pop it in here is just madness. I don't know whether this was Chen Shesiang showing off or Harold Acton showing off, but, you know, just get rid of it. And then, of course, it's because this whole little stanza is supposed to be the mother talking to the father about the baby who started to cry, you know. And still this urchin interrupts one's sleep. He always cries in dreams. Tomorrow must we have his fortune told? Okay. Midnight or lonely afternoon. Now, where does he get the idea of lonely afternoon? I'm sorry, Harold. I'm sorry, Chen Shesiang, but let's go back to the Chinese. Midnight or lonely afternoon, the wooden clapper passes over them. Okay, let's just look at the Chinese. No, it's the next line. There we are. It's midnight. Okay, 深夜。又是清冷的下午。Can you remember what he said for that? I've forgotten already. Lonely afternoon. How on earth could you translate 清冷的下午 as lonely afternoon? I'm sorry, it's just the wrong word, you know. Sometimes these problems are very simple, they're just the wrong word. I could take a 5-minute break and ask you all to write down how you would translate 清冷的下午, but I mean, I'm not going to do that because we don't have time. But I'm just pointing out that it's not right. Okay, well, so much for that quite lovely little poem. And by Bian Zhilin. I mean, Bian Zhilin wrote some, good B-plus poetry. But the translation is definitely not even B-minus, frankly. Somnambulism, domicile. I mean, these words are totally inappropriate for this simple, imagistic, symbolist poem. Okay, let's move on now. Now, so that was the very first real anthology of Chinese modern poetry, and it was very important. I mean, when you remember, there was basically nothing before that. So Harold Acton and his young friend Chen Zhixiang, did a very good thing. But later on, of course, the whole political and social environment changed when the Japanese occupied, China, and Beida and, as you know, Tsinghua, Nankai, they all moved down to Kunming, to Sinan Lianda. And now we come across the second anthology, which I happen to, again, have a copy of here. It's quite a rare book. I'll leave it here. You can have a look at it in the interval. And this was a young, I think he's Canadian, I'm not sure, Robert Payne. He happened to end up in Kunming teaching at Sinan Lianda. And he was a very, very experienced journalist, writer, novelist. He produced so many books. You can look it all up on the internet. But so he was a very experienced writer. Actually, probably more experienced than Harold Acton. Harold Acton was really what we might call a poseur, A poseur is somebody who, wears fancy clothes. And we were talking earlier on about the late Wenhua Buzhang, Wang Meng, He always dressed so well. And he was a real poseur, show off nice clothes, I mean, I buy my clothes at Uniqlo, He would buy his clothes at, Lane Crawford or somewhere really smart like that. Harold Acton would always go to Harrods, and this guy, but Harold Acton he knew how to talk, right? But he wasn't a really experienced writer, not in the way that Robert Payne was. Robert Payne was a real working journalist and essayist, novelist, and so on. And he wrote many, many biographies of Hitler and all these famous people. And he wrote a biography of he wrote a biography of Mao Zedong, actually. He met Mao Zedong. He met Mao in Yan'an, I think. And he wrote a book about Mao called Ruler of Red China. And he taught, here's a typical photo of Sinan Lianda. Because, of course, it was again, political and social environment. All these people moved down to Kunming, including the great British poet William Empson. And they taught in this amazing place in Kunming, where they were completely isolated from the Japanese and indeed from the communists and the KMT. It was a very special moment, politically and socially, and it created a very special product. Many of the great minds of the later 40s and 50s were developed at Sinan Lianda. It's a very important moment in Chinese intellectual history. And famous figures there included, for example, the great poet and scholar Wen Yiduo. Wen Yiduo was a major young person at Sinan Lianda, and we'll talk about him in a moment. And Robert Payne, anyway, he ended up teaching at Sinan Lianda, and he got to know a lot of these young students because they were all keen to speak English and so on. He didn't know a word of Chinese, nor did Harold Acton. Let's get that straight. Harold Acton knew not one word of Chinese, nor did Robert Payne. But Robert Payne got on very well. He produced a book of classical Chinese poetry called The White Pony, in collaboration with about 20 of his young students at Sinan Lianda. It's a very good little anthology, actually. Each poet gets a different translator. Oh, sorry, I'm going to sneeze. The microphone will probably explode when I sneeze. Okay, I've managed to stifle my sneeze. So Robert Payne's most famous book was this, the Anthology of Chinese Poetry, which is classical poems all the way from the Shi Jing right up to Mao Zedong. And that's still very, very widely read. And then, but he also he also did this book, which is called Contemporary Chinese Poetry. And he edited translations by a whole group of his students. And one of the poets that he included quite a lot of was young Wen Yiduo. And of course, shortly after the war, Wen Yiduo was assassinated, as we know, probably by the Kuomintang. A brilliant, brilliant man. A great, probably for my money, I'd put him A minus. You know, he's one of the great Chinese poets of the 20th century. And partly because he had such a strong training in classical studies. He was a great expert on the Chu Ci, for example. And his classical scholarship was extremely high quality. I'm a great admirer of Wen Yiduo. Of course, the other poet who's in Robert Paine's anthology, and also in Harold Acton's, was the famous Xu Zhimo. And there he is with his third lady. He was a great specialist in beautiful ladies, as we all know. He had several of them. This was his third one, Lu Xiaoman, looking rather nice in that strange outfit. Anyway, these are the great young poets of the time. And this is, of course, Xu Zhimo's most famous poem, which you probably all had to learn at high school. I do apologize. I did at least convert it into Fantasia. Did I? Yes, I think so. Anyway, it's rather charming in a sort of lightweight B minor sort of way. I wouldn't make students learn it by heart. And here's the translation from Robert Paine's book. Actually, the translation's by, in those days, a young student called Yuan Kejia. He went on to become a very famous literary critic in communist China. But in those days, he was translating for Robert Paine from the Chinese. He later went on to translate Western poets like W.B. Yeats into Chinese. He was an important figure in the literary establishment, but not what you'd call a great poet. Anyway, this is his version. Silently I go, as silently I came. Silently I wave my hand and bid farewell to the western clouds. Now, for me, at the very outset, I have to say the rhythm in this is better than the rhythm in Harold Acton and Chen Zhexiang. It has a natural rhythm to it. Silently I go, as silently I came. Silently I wave my hand and bid farewell to the western clouds. It has a cadence, it has a rhythm immediately. And I would say, I'm just guessing here, but I would say the reason is that Robert Paine was a very experienced editor and journalist who knew how to write English, and probably wrote better English than Harold Acton. The golden willows on the river bank are brides beneath the setting sun. Their flaming shadows in the waves' light move softly on my heart. You see, the rhythm continues to be very fluent, very easy, very relaxed. And the original poem is extremely colloquial and relaxed. Green wood in soft clay, greenly tossing beneath the water. In the soft waves of the Cam, I am content to be a weed. The pool under the elm's shadow is not a clear spring, but a rainbow shattered among pond weeds, falling at last into rainbow dreams. Who seeks dreams? Poling a long pole, roving through places greener than green grass. A boat fully loaded with starlight sings beneath splendid stars. Now I cannot sing aloud, and silent are the farewell flutes. Even the insects are silent for me on this silent Cambridge night. Silently I go, as silently I came. I wave my sleeves, carrying away no silk of clouds. Now, I almost go as far as B+ on that, because he's really managed to create a unified, flowing poem out of the Chinese. So, to my surprise, I end up giving a higher estimation of Robert Paine's work than I do of Harold Acton's, even though I'm actually a very big admirer of Harold Acton as a figure, as a poseur, He was more of a kind of social figure than a working craftsman. But Robert Paine, you see, he probably spent hours going over Yuan Kejia's first draft. Again, collaboration. He probably, as a professional writer, a journalist working to a deadline, he knew how to correct, he knew how to edit. And that's very important, and it shows, it really shows in this. So that's, now a little bit later than Robert Payne, one of the really important British poets of the 20th century, William Empson, ended up by chance teaching at Beida. And this is a famous photograph of him. I'm trying to find him. I can't see him. Oh, there he is. I think that's him there. He had a very long beard. I can't see that picture very well. No, that's him. That's him. And he had a whole... He never produced a book like Acton or Payne. But he had a whole generation of students whom he trained. He was a very good teacher, a very brilliant intellect. And some of his students went on to be very important figures in China. For example, those of you who followed this would have heard of a gentleman named Wang Zuoliang. Wang Zuoliang, who died maybe 10, 15 years ago. I knew him in the early 80s. He was one of the key figures in the post-49 literary world. And he was trained by William Empson, as indeed were many others. So I mention William Empson simply to show how by the 40s, again, you know, after the war was over, we're talking about 46, 47, when the Japanese have already surrendered, and Beida came back into its own in Beijing, in Peking, sorry. And William Empson was right there. He'd been down to Xinjiang, but he went back to Beida, and a very important figure, but he never produced a book. It might have been a very interesting book indeed, but it never happened. Now, as we move through the 30s and 40s, there are certain things, and into the 50s and 60s, and following up on my theme of political and social change affecting translation, I have to mention two publications which are very important. The first one was Tianxia Monthly, which came out of Shanghai. What is an absolutely wonderful publication. A lot of it is now available online. And it was a whole generation of Shanghai intellectuals who were often bilingual. I mean, people like Lin Yutang, Wen Yuanning, people like that, and Wu Zhixiong, people like that. And they produced wonderful material in Shanghai. And then, of course, after 1949, that simply stopped. But meanwhile, after 49, the tradition of Tianxia came back in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a very, very important place. I mean, in every respect. But in terms of literature and translation, Hong Kong is a very important place. And in the early 60s, Hong Kong was very fortunate because at Chinese University, at Zhongwen Daxue, there was a gentleman by the name of George Gao, who initiated this new journal called Renditions, Yizong. And George Gao, I met him a few times, he was, again, from the Shanghai world. He brought that tradition to Hong Kong, and he established Renditions. There he is later on in life. He did a wonderful Chinese translation of The Great Gatsby, for example, and a very humorous, civilized, cosmopolitan individual. And he worked together with his friend Stephen Sung Qi, also from Shanghai. And I had the great privilege and honor of working with Sung Qi from 1982 until the end of 1986. So for 4 years, I was his deputy, and then I succeeded him as the editor of Renditions. And Renditions continued to play a very, very important role in promoting Chinese literature through translation, including modern poetry. And I had a very, very fruitful 4 years from 82 to 86 working with Stephen, who was a direct inheritor of the tradition of Tianxia and of Shanghai. But he left China, he was intelligent enough to leave. Now, Stephen put together several important anthologies, including this one on Ci poetry, and then this one called Trees on the Mountain, which in fact we did together. Stevenson and me, you see. I'm not trying to promote myself, but we produced this book of modern Chinese literature, and it was it was the first time Stephen had ever really agreed to publish mainland poets. And I had to work on him for several months to persuade him, because, you know, he didn't have a high opinion of Chinese contemporary poetry. But in the end, we put out this book, and it was actually a hardbound version of this issue of the magazine called Chinese Literature Today. And it was a very important book. I mean, I say this without trying to flatter myself, because what we did was, for the first time ever, we had a whole section devoted to modern Chinese poetry from the mainland. And we put it in a political and social context. So not only did we print translations of poetry, we also printed the political attacks on those poets. And this was to put them into their context. We had also, in the book, we had Hong Kong poetry. We had Taiwan poetry. We put it all together. I don't think it had ever been done before. We had a lot of poetry from Hong Kong, including the work of Huang Guobin, and translated by himself. And we had a whole anthology of Taiwanese poets. So we were trying to create this idea of a commonwealth of Chinese literature. I think it was the first time. And then, meanwhile, also in Taipei, again, politically and socially, Taiwan was a different place. And amazing amount of literary talent in Taiwan. But because of its political situation, very largely ignored by the international community. Now, there was one journal in Taiwan that did its best to promote Chinese literature from Taiwan in translation. I did a lot of work for them, especially for this wonderful lady, Qi Bangyuan. She edited it, she promoted it, and she's still alive today. She's 93, I think. A wonderful lady who single-handedly led the movement to promote Taiwan literature in the world. And I'm very glad to say she's just been honored with an honorary doctorate from Indiana University, which she richly deserves as a promoter of the translation of Chinese poetry and fiction from Taiwan. And a very fine translator, especially, called John Balcom, specialized in translating Taiwanese poetry. Now, again, political and social events. Excuse me while I have a drop of my coffee. And try to hide it. In 1978, as we all know, major changes took place in China. And finally, the Cultural Revolution came to an end. The Gang of Four were arrested and so on and so forth. Deng Xiaoping came back. And for a brief moment, at a place called Democracy Wall, people started putting up posters, and a very famous figure, Wei Jingsheng, asked for, democracy. Of course, he never got it, but I mean, we still don't have it today. I'm not supposed to say that, sorry. Democracy Wall. Anyway, it was a brief moment when this flowering of free expression took place. And as a result of that, and it's very important to make this point, as a result of that political and social development, there was a whole new generation of writers, poets especially. And I happened to be in Hong Kong in the 80s, and I was able to take advantage of my position in Hong Kong to publish translations of poetry by this new generation of poets. Well, I produced a book with my friend Jeremy Barmay called Seeds of Fire. This is the Hong Kong edition with a very lovely cover. It later got published in America. And that was really the first time that anyone had taken seriously, from a point of view of translation, the work of these poets who were known as Menglong Shiren, And especially the three of them I was quite closely involved with. One was Gu Cheng, who was a close personal friend of mine. And this is a great caricature, a great cartoon by the famous Hua Junwu, where someone's introducing a Menglong poet. You see, there's nothing there. There's just a kind of mist, Hua Junwu was so funny. And, we present a famous Menglong poet who's going to recite some of his poems. And there he is, disappearing into the mist. I love that cartoon. And here's another of the Menglong poets, Yang Lian. He's now living in London and becoming more and more famous as an exiled poet. I translated a lot of his early work because it was part of that movement, that excited rebirth of literature during the 80s, you know. It didn't last very long, but I mean, for a few years, these young poets came out with a kind of new sort of poetry that was expression of freedom, of creative freedom. Amazing. And because of the political context, it got a lot of attention, and it was very exciting. And of course, the other figure was Beidao, who now lives in Hong Kong. He was the leader of this group and the editor of the magazine Jin Tian, you know, which is still being published in Hong Kong. And these people, they were given perhaps disproportionate attention because of political reasons, you know, because they stood as a symbol for freedom. And when there couldn't be actual political freedom, at least for a brief moment, there was poetic freedom. So they acquired this huge, they were given this massive amount of attention. And looking back on it with hindsight, I have to agree that this was not really deserved from a purely literary point of view. Again, we're talking about B minors here. This is Yu Guangzhong's, you know, assessment of these poets' work. But it was politically very important. And of course, this is the famous poem by Beidao called 我不相信, I do not believe. I came into this world bringing only paper, rope, a shadow, to proclaim before the judgment the voice that has been judged. Let me tell you, world, I do not believe. If 1,000 challenges lie beneath your feet, count me as number 1,001. I don't believe the sky is blue. I don't believe in thunder's echoes. I don't believe that dreams are false. I don't believe that death has no revenge. It's not a bad poem, but it's also not, I mean, it doesn't compare with, say, W.H. Auden or, you know, William Empson, for example. Now, at this point, I want to have a little break because I want to mention that side by side with all of this new interesting stuff, there was also the machine of the political world, which was represented by the government-financed Waiwenju, you know, the foreign languages press that produced politically acceptable translations of politically acceptable writers. And as a symbol of that, I want to, some of you may not know about this man, he's called Rui Ali. He's a New Zealander, and he lived nearly all his life in China. He was a remarkable man in many respects. Oh, thank you very much, I have seen the time, yeah. He was a very remarkable man, and here you have him. He met Mao Zedong many times, and he also met Zhou Enlai, you know. He was a real friend of the Chinese people, and he had a good feel for language. He was what you might call an amateur poet, and he produced lots of books of translations of Chinese poetry, which were very politically acceptable within China. And anything he wrote, here's one of his books called Peace Through the Ages. He produced lots of those anthologies. They're sort of okay, you know. He had a way of writing which was quite personal. I quite like it, actually, but he wasn't a great translator, and I'm not going to take up many more of your time with Rui Ali. I just want to pay my respects to this old man. He died many years ago. And one of the poets he particularly liked and translated was Ai Qing. And Ai Qing, you know, Ai Qing was one of those generation of poets who tried to support the communist regime with his very patriotic poetry. But even so, he suffered greatly, you know, during the regime's persecution of writers. Ai Qing did. Okay, I think we'll stop there because I've already been shown the 3 o'clock sign. So we have a quick break, then we'll come back. Okay, thank you. So we were just talking about the official organization known as Waiwenju, the Foreign Languages Press. And they always had a political agenda. Of course, that was their job. They were created based on the Russian, the Soviet model. They were the official. I often used to visit Waiwenju when I was in China. And it's a huge place. And that's where Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang lived. and they produced officially acceptable translations of officially acceptable writers. And they were always of a quite good sort of professional standard, but there was no sort of, they weren't dancing in chains, put it that way, you know. They were in chains but not dancing. Now, some of you may have heard of this gentleman. I wish to bring him up now as an absolute prime example of the talent in China that was so terribly sacrificed politically. Now this gentleman, his name Pang Bingjun, he was a very close friend of mine. He died 2 years ago. And this is an earlier photograph of him. And in the, this is a later photograph of me with him in Melbourne in 2017, when he died about 2 months later. I was able to be with him during his last months, I'm very glad to say. And in the 1980s, when I came to Hong Kong, I was able to invite him to visit Zhongwen Daxue as a visiting scholar. And as a result of that, he and I and a mutual friend of ours called Sean Golden, who had also taught, I taught in Tianjin, you see, for 2 years. That's where I met Pang Bingjun. He was professor of English at Nankai Daxue in Tianjin. And at the same time, in Tianjin, there was this very, very clever scholar called Sean Golden, who was a specialist in James Joyce and W.B. Yeats. And he gave public lectures on modernism, a brilliant scholar. And he and Pang and I became close friends, and we worked together in Hong Kong in the mid-80s to produce this book. This is the mainland edition. It was just called Modern Chinese Poems, you know, 中国现代诗100首, 100 modern Chinese poems. It was published by the commercial press. And the main author of this book was Pang Bingjun. He selected the poems, and we worked on them together. But it was a wonderful anthology, and this, in a sense, belongs in the story that begins with Acton and Chen Shexiang in Beijing, and then Payne in Kunming, and then this is Hong Kong in the 1980s, during that period of relative kaifang, you know. And Pang Bingjun was allowed to visit Hong Kong. We made a fresh selection of Chinese poetry, and very much influenced by the work I was doing with Stephen Sung. So we included Taiwanese poets, we included Hong Kong poets, and we included all the Hmong poets, but also we included the poet who I think is the greatest Chinese poet of the 20th century, by the name of Mu Dan. And this is the picture of Mu Dan when he was a young man, a beautiful face. He studied in Kunming. He was a student of Robert Payne's and a contemporary of Wen Yiduo. And a very, very fine poet. Unfortunately, during the 1950s, he came up against the political system, and he was made a You Pai, you know. And then later on, during the Cultural Revolution, he suffered terribly. He was a professor of English at Nankai Daxue in Tianjin, so he was both a colleague and a friend of Pang Bingjun. And Pang Bingjun's great mission in life was to translate and to promote the work of his friend Mu Dan. And Mu Dan didn't write very many poems, but about half of them are really A+. I mean, really A+. And during the communist period, he gave up writing poetry almost completely until the last years of his life, and he concentrated on translating. He translated the great romantic poets, Keats and Shelley and Byron. He translated the whole of Byron's Don Juan, which is a novel in rhyming verse. It's a brilliant translation. He also translated the modern poets like W.H. Auden and Russian poets like Pushkin. So he really devoted himself to translation until the last years of his life. Now, I'm afraid I didn't have time to give you the Chinese of this, but there's a very great poem of Mu Dan's called 智慧之歌, the Song of Wisdom. And Pang Bingjun and I and Sean Golden, we worked on this poem a lot. I think it's one of the greatest poems of modern Chinese poetry. I'd just like to read it with you. I have reached illusion's end in this grove of falling leaves. Each leaf a signal of past joy drifting sear within my heart. Some were loves of youthful days, blazing meteors in a distant sky, extinguished, vanished without a trace, or fallen dead at my feet, stiff and icy cold. Some were boisterous friendships, flowers in full bloom, but ignorant of the coming fall. Society contained the pulsing blood within its grid. Life cast molten passion in reality's mould. Another joy, the spell of high ideals, drew me through many a twisting mile of thorns. It is no pain to suffer for ideals, but oh, to watch them change into an object of scorn. Now, nothing remains but the agonies which punish me daily for my past pride. When the glory of the sky stands condemned in this wasteland, what color can survive? There is one tree that stands alone, intact. It thrives, I know, on suffering's blood. Its green shade mocks me ruthlessly. Oh, wisdom tree, I curse your every growing bud. It's the most amazingly powerful poem. I mean, I wish I could have read you the Chinese, but I haven't got the time to put it on the PowerPoint. And it stands for me, this poem, as one of the great symbols of what could have been the greatness of Chinese poetry in the 20th century. And it's just one of about a dozen poems that he wrote in the last year of his life, shortly before he died. And I'm pleased to say that I'm currently working on the complete poems of Mudan on Pang Bingjun's translation, which I hope to be published in the next couple of years. It's one of the last tasks I have left, because I'm a huge admirer of Mudan. His real name was Zhao Liangzheng. He was a cousin of Jin Yong, you know, Zhao Liangrong. They were all from the great Jia family, which is one of the big literary families of China. They were cousins. All right. Now, I'm going to end by talking about two very different poets. One is this poet, Liang Bingguan, Ye Si or Ya Si. I always called him PK because that was his nickname, you know. You know what PK means in Cantonese, okay? Bakaya. I mean, he liked to make fun of things, you see. So he always liked the fact that if he was in a room and someone called out PK, you know, everyone looked round because they thought they were saying something bad, but it was just his nickname, you see. And he was one of the most. Every time he died, you know, 4 or 5 years ago now, even more maybe. 2012, I think it was, or 13. Anyway, 5 or 6 years ago. And one of my very closest friends, I will be quite honest with you, every time I come to Hong Kong, he is the person I miss the most, because he taught me what Hong Kong really is about, you know. And I explored many parts of Hong Kong with him, usually a bar here or a restaurant there. He loved food, he liked drink, he loved people. He had a very generous mind, a very generous heart. And he was also a fantastic poet. I mean, in the tradition, for me, he was in the tradition of Bo Zhuyi of the Tang Dynasty, who could write about everyday things, you know. He would find something to write about this cup of coffee, you know, about the fact that I have to hide it behind this teapot, and about the fact that, you know, he found in everyday life the inspiration for his poetry. And he wrote about food, he wrote about clothes, he wrote about village customs, he wrote about modern cinema and so on. And we developed a very close friendship over the years. And then this comes back to, one, political and social environments. We got to know each other in the 1980s, and we continue to know each other in Hong Kong, which is a very special place, you know, a very, very special place culturally and in terms of literature. Hong Kong was an enormously important place, and he, above all people, was the one who stood for Hong Kong in terms of literature. He refused to regard Hong Kong as an inferior place. For him, Hong Kong was a very, very rich environment in which to create literature, and he proved that every year with something new. I'd like to talk about one particular event. It was in I can't remember the year now, I think it was even 97, but anyway, he came to see me one day and he said, "John, I'm organizing a special event. It's all about clothes." He had a friend who was a clothes designer called Wessie Ling. She was tiny, but a very, very talented, excitable young lady who trained in Manchester in fashion design. And she had very, very avant-garde ideas about clothes, right? And he and Wessie Ling were going to do a special event in the Hong Kong Centre for Visual Arts in the park. And he was writing some poetry for it. And she was going to design some funny clothes, and they were going to parody fashion, right? The idea was to make fun of fashion, okay? But they were going to make fun of it in such a good way that lots of people wouldn't realize they were making fun. And he said to me over a drink, "John, we're looking for models because we want to have beautiful young ladies who can pretend to be fashion models, but they're not really fashion models because we're really satirizing fashion." And I said, "Well, you know, my daughter's very pretty, and she's got lots of pretty friends at the French. She was going to the French school. She was about 15. So PK, you see, he's like, oh, good idea, let's just get all her friends to come." So I said to my daughter, Laura, "Tell your friends we want them all to come to a fashion show. And they'll all be made up by, you know, Chanel and Dior and Yves Saint Laurent." And so, of course, all my daughter's teenage friends took the day off school without telling the teachers why, and they came to this fashion show. And the whole morning they had makeup and hairdos, and then they put on Wessie Ling's fashion clothes, which were mostly sacks and chains and strange cardboard boxes and things. And then PK wrote some crazy poems about Barbie dolls and things, and a group of my students, in fact some of them are here today, translated them for me, and we produced this very funny little booklet of poems to go with the clothes, you know, all about Barbie dolls and Ken and kind of, Batman and silly stuff, you know, really just throwaway stuff, but really funny. And the actual event was very, very funny because most of the people there didn't realize it was just a joke, you know. They thought it was serious fashion. And that was the whole point, was to make fun of the people there, the journalists. They didn't know how to take it. It was the most wonderful event. And PK was always doing that. He knew fashion designers, photographers, dancers, filmmakers. And, you know, he liked nothing more than getting people together, having fun, and doing something creative and exciting, you know. He was the archetypal poet, you know. Wonderful, wonderful presence. And he gave so much. He was so generous. He would encourage everybody. He welcomed people to take part. And he was also a great writer. I mean, he knew how to write. Very, very prolific. He wrote fiction. He wrote film reviews, he wrote cultural studies, he wrote poetry, masses of poetry. I'm currently, oh sorry, that's not the microphone. I'm currently editing his collected poems for publication this year in Hong Kong, and it's a job I'm very, very happy and proud to be doing in his memory, because he was one of my very best friends. And there he is in a more thoughtful mood. That's him when he was a bit younger. The poor man died of lung cancer. He never smoked a cigarette in his life. And here he is, again, very young, in Hong Kong. And there he is with Gu Cheng and Gu Cheng's wife, Xie Ye. These were also my very close friends. And he loved meeting, he welcomed them to Hong Kong, you know. He had no sort of inhibitions about welcoming mainland poets. Now, this is one of his early poems, which I worked on in the 1980s when I first got to know him. It's a very difficult poem. It's a very modern, serious poem. I'd like to read it with you. Again, I'm afraid I didn't have time to provide the Chinese, but you'll see from this poem that when PK is being serious, he's capable of being as serious as Mudan. In fact, his PhD thesis was very largely about Mudan. He was a great admirer of Mudan. And he wrote a whole series of poems about lotus leaves, lian ye, and this one is one of them. And he uses the lotus as a kind of metaphor for life, for human relationships, for the human condition. And it's a very, very impressive series of poems. I shall have them all in my anthology. The word lotus is itself archaic. If we cannot find our own seeds bud new flowers, pointing to this trembling pale red apex, you name it, Futu, Handan, many fine names, beautiful, splendid names, having no relation with me. What significance do their beauty and splendor possess? So, sorry about that. The lotus immediately becomes a kind of symbol for the understanding of people, how you understand people, I wait in faith to hear at length the sepal breath. I am heavy and clumsy, thwarted by mud. You drift lightly across the water, shedding the petals of yesterday, a fresh, clean face again in a public world, amidst the disseminations of men. My leaves and stalks are also loaded with human clamour, but muddy, sluggish, caught in private nightmares and perilous deluges of dawn, and my roots, tangled in silt, cannot make themselves clear. Before I can finish, you turn impatiently to the attentive gaze of others, the rhetoric habitual, recognized, I think, eventually, my words will be futile. So I think there's supposed to be a full stop there, recognized, full stop. I think eventually my words will be futile, will fail to make you abandon the demarcations or feel true cold and warmth. If you are for grandeur, you will naturally find my lack of embellishment shabby. Finally, I fall silent, looking to the distant hills, watching the pale blues and greyish greens rush onwards, breaking the symmetry. Every time I reread this poem, I'm overwhelmed by its poetic substance. This is a great poet. And, often PK would write light-hearted stuff, but this is his most serious work in the early 80s. He wrote a whole sequence of poems like this. For a translator, it's very challenging because I don't want it to become too pretentious. I know it's very modern, it's very serious, but I want it to remain human, I want it to, and the choice of words is very, very careful here. I was actually working on an earlier draft by two young Chinese students of PK's, but I changed it a great deal. And I tried to make it, as I once said, these poems are almost metaphysical, The lotus becomes a kind of a medium in which to reflect human interactions and human self-discovery and relationships. I think they're some of the great poems of Chinese literature in the 20th. Along with Mudan, I think PK is one of the great poets of the modern age in China. This is another poem of his, which he wrote when he came to visit my house in France. House in the valley, 山谷里的房子. Rising at dawn, I stroll to the empty space behind the house. I see, it's all about my house in France. I see a hammock slung between trees, a little sauna shed. Skirting the house, I reach another terrace, another door, a staircase leading to yet another hidden corner, ragged creepers rambling along the builder's heartlines. 30 years ago, a young hippie dreamed of being a shepherd somewhere beyond the dusty world. He decided to rebuild this ruined sheep pen, keeping the old stone stairs to who knows where. Ancient fossils jut from the steps, dragon bones leading to an upper room suspended in the void, an infinite space awaiting the fullness of time. The new master, that's me, has added Chinese roof tiles. Here in the vineyards of the Midi, he translates tales of fox spirits from the distant Chinese hills. That's the Liao Zhai Ji Yi. Today we sit together outside in the courtyard drinking tea, his books piled high on the table. Sorry. At dusk I watched the last rays of the sunset gild the hilltops beyond the garden wall. One day the child painting grapes will be a man. One of my kids was painting grapes, you see, in the courtyard. The wise elders wait for the rich harvest to ripen on the wheel of time. I like this poem because, well, partly because it's personally important to me, because it's about my house and me and his visit to my house. He came twice. But also because it's an interesting example of how he takes a very serious way of thinking. He's thinking about place, about time, about history, about the way environments evolve. But he makes it very colloquial. It's not like the Lotus poem. This is more like sort of Boji. He's talking in a very colloquial way, chatting, you know. And it's more typical of PK. Okay, I'm going to end on a rather strange note because, as you can see from what I've been saying, on the whole, I'm not a big admirer of modern Chinese poetry. I'm a great admirer of Liang Bingguan, of Ye Si. I think he's a great poet. I'm a great admirer of Mu Dan. And in a sense, they were both outsiders. They were none of them establishment figures. They were both free spirits. Mu Dan suffered enormously in mainland China for being a free spirit, for refusing to kowtow to the authorities. You know, he suffered enormously. A terrible story. But PK didn't suffer in the same way, but he was never taken seriously. You know, he was always regarded as a bit of a kind of outsider. You know, on the margins. He was never taken seriously, and I think that would have pleased him because he didn't take himself seriously either. He treated himself with enormous modesty, you know, and yet he produced thousands of poems, and amongst those there are really some very, very brilliant poems. Some of them are quite ephemeral, but some of them are very, very serious and very deep. And he was also very proud of Cantonese. You know, he never read his poetry in Guoyu. He always read it in Cantonese, and it always sounded good. It always sounds better in Cantonese. He was very proud of Hong Kong. He was very proud of Cantonese, and he was very defiantly a free spirit. Now, I want to end by talking about a poet that probably none of you have ever heard of. I know about him because I was asked to translate 29 of his poems. And they're modern in the sense that they were written in the modern age. But they're not at all modern in style, because they're actually written according to the classical Ci Pai. They are Ci poems, right? They are modern Ci poems. And there are really only two figures like this in the 20th century. One is this man, whose name was Sung Xunlun, or he writes it like this. And the other was, of course, the far more famous Mao Zedong, okay, who wrote Ci poems as well. And I'm pleased to say that the very perceptive Hong Kong critic called Dong Qiao wrote an essay in Hong Kong some years ago comparing this man's Ci poems with the Ci poems of Mao Zedong. And he said this man's poems were far, far better than Mao Zedong's, which is true. And it's a story I would like to share with you because in the 1990s I was living in France, growing grapes. I decided to retire to the countryside. And I got an email one day from this man's son, whose name was Song Xiukang, and out of the blue. And he said, Mr. Minford, I've read your translation of an essay on Ci poetry. I'm looking for someone to translate my father's Ci poems. Would you agree to do so? And I said to my wife, oh, goodness me, this will be so difficult. And she said, well, look, just write back to him and say, maybe I will, maybe I won't, send me the poems. So he sent me the poems. And I said to my wife, who was my great advisor in these matters, they're so difficult. You know, this is going to be really hard. So she said, well, just charge him a lot of money, you know. So I'm a great one for being realistic about life. So I wrote back to him and said, yes, this will cost you blah, 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 blah. And he said, by return email, he said, give me your bank details. I want to put the money in your bank today. A man of incredible generosity. Also, a dedicated filial son, because he was doing this for his old father. His old father wanted his poems published in English translation. So I spent the next 6 months working on these 29 poems. And this is the resultant book, which you're very welcome to come and look at, which was published in Taiwan with my translations. And at the end of 6 months, and I spoke to the son yesterday, he doesn't mind if I share this story with you. He's one of my he became one of my close friends. And at the end of 6 months, I wrote back to this young man, Sung Shu Kang, and said, here are my translations. There are 6 places where I don't understand the poems. And they are this. He wrote back to me the same day saying, have you heard this story before? Put your hand up if you have. Okay, all right. I never know. As you get old, you forget how many times you've told stories. You know. I make my children hold up a red card if I've said it. Anyway, okay, so I haven't, maybe some of you have heard it, but you're not going to put your hand up because you're too kind. So he wrote back straight away and he said, listen, I'm on the next plane to Perpignan, which was the nearest city. I booked a room in the hotel and I want you to come and stay. I booked you a room as well. We need to talk. I thought, what? Anyway, he flew the next day and booked into the top hotel in Perpignan. That's the nearest city. And I went to meet him for dinner, and then we stayed up all night talking. We went through the poems, and he pointed out that every single case where I hadn't understood it was because I was not supposed to understand it. I said, what do you mean? Because he said it's all about a secret love affair my father had in the 1930s and about secret meetings he had in Hangzhou with this young lady. And he didn't want anyone to know. Oh, I said, that's tricky. What do I do about that? I better go back and translate them all over again. I said, okay, because they're all about certain hotels. And I mean, you know, so I did them again, sent them back, and he showed them to his father, who said, oh no, you can't make that so obvious. You have to cover it all up again. Okay. So it's like found and lost in translation. So I then had to redo it so that it wasn't so obvious, right? And it was great fun, because in the course of doing this, I discovered what was going on within the mind of a poet, you know. He was, because he was happily married. I mean, I don't know about happily, but he was married. I have no idea, probably happily married, and living with his wife in Bangkok at this point. And the young lady he was in love with, I think, carried on living in Shanghai. Eventually died, but she was a young lady, a painter, very beautiful, and a very fine artist. And he was very romantically attached to her. And of course, in the spirit of Tzu poetry, that's an ideal subject for a Tzu poem, you know, love that will never be consummated, love that was always eluding you, you know, the perfect love affair that never really took place. And what a perfect subject for Tzu poetry, right? And you couldn't really write a poem by Mu Dan on that subject, or Bian Zhelin. Maybe Xu Zhimo would write a bad poem about it, right? Okay? Because Xu Zhimo was always having unsuccessful or moderately successful love affairs. But in this case, this man, Sung Swinlong, he actually had the perfect vehicle for writing this kind of poetry about an impossible love, okay? Now, before we look at the poems, I think I should show you some pictures, because very luckily yesterday I met his son, we had lunch together, and he gave me all these pictures on a USB. So it's a wonderful, he's one of my closest friends. Through literature I made this wonderful friendship. And I've got photos of the father. This is the father as a young man, slightly older man. He was a very successful financier in Shanghai, working for the Kuomintang. And later he didn't get on so well with Chiang Kai-shek, so he came to Hong Kong and worked for a big shipping magnate. and eventually retired to Bangkok with his wife. He was obviously a very successful person in the world of finance. Now this is the young lady, right? Rather charming photograph of her. She was a painter, a young lady who painted. There's another equally charming photograph of her. And these are some of her paintings. Sorry, I missed one there. This is, of course, obviously inspired by Hong Lamang. It's a young lady with a parrot. We all know who that is. This is another of her paintings. That's another one. And there's a picture of the gentleman with the painting by Zhou Jianxia in the background, you see. I mean, he continued to nurture these feelings for decades after they'd ceased to see each other, And his wife used to go around the house trying to find evidence of this terrible affair and tearing up the paper and burning it and so on. So it was a beautifully wonderful secret thing, all of which was expressed in these poems, And I, as a translator, was privileged to have this insight into the inner life of a poet. And we can call him modern, we can call him antique, we can call him timeless. I don't care. He lived in the 20th century, he wrote Chinese poetry, so for me he's a modern Chinese poet. But nobody's heard of him because he was never part of any kind of official, school of poetry. He was just an individual who was a great connoisseur of literature and art. There he is in rather a nice pose. Here he is in his earlier youth on a sort of excursion in Suzhou, I think. And then he was also friends of the great Manchu prince painter, Pu Ru or Pu Xinyu in Taiwan, and Pu Xinyu gave him various. There he is, together with. There's Pu Ru, the Manchu prince, who was a very fine painter living in Taiwan, and there's Mr. Sung with his friend. Another Pu Xinyu painting given to him. And here he is with friends and the famous calligrapher Yu Youren. Look at that beard, my goodness. What a beard. Anyway, there's Mr. Sung. And this is the opening page of the book of his poems, 29 poems. And the dedication you can see is to his son, you see, Kang Er, you see. And this is his Hao. And this is his son who I had lunch with yesterday in Hong Kong. And this is the book. It's here. You can come and have a look at it afterwards if you want to. Now, I just picked one or two poems. I unfortunately didn't have time to make the Chinese for you, but I'll just read one of them because I don't think we have time to read them all. No, we don't have time to read them all. But let's just take this one. I wrote this poem. It's to the Cipai Ying Ti Xu, right? Literally, the Orioles Lament. I wrote this poem in 1933 when I was still in my early 20s. It has the hallmarks of youth, a certain sincerity, a certain heartfelt candor. When I read it again now, I cannot help smiling, and yet it has undeniable qualities. Metrically, it abides faithfully by the rules recorded by Wan Shu, author of this great treatise. Its rhymes accord with the principles in the Cilin Zhengyun of Gezai in the 19th century. There is a sense of diligent application about it, an unmistakable intensity. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Now, this is in the tradition of a poet writing a little preface to his poem. It's very helpful for us to understand this. And this was part of the tradition. So don't forget, he's writing in the 1930s, but he's writing almost like he's in the Song dynasty, It's timeless. It's timeless. And for me, it questions the whole concept of modernity. I don't give a damn for modernity. I'm not a modern person, I live in the Victorian, Edwardian, Georgian. I don't care. I live in China in the Tang dynasty, in China in the Qing dynasty. For me, time is of no importance. And I question the very concept of modernism or modernity. And this poet happens to be writing in the 1930s, but I think he's writing a fine poem about a timeless theme, as you'll see. And I've tried to translate it in the style of a traditional Si poem. Hard to cast aside the myriad threads of ancient grief, I still recall the shining pendant, the misty tresses, still remember the tender, lingering words of bygone days, as she recounted in detail the precious news of her visit to the West. That easy smile as we sat at her feet to learn, the subtle dots of rouge, the delicate fingers, so sleek, the way she drove her fancy car, fluttering like a startled swan, soft dust rising in her wake, last traces of her scent. Once I knocked respectfully at her door. The turquoise screen was unfurled, and there I saw a maidservant, fair beyond all telling. Through the slats of the screen, faint flower shadows, and a courtyard brimming with fragrance. Beside the makeup case, exquisite words, a subtle elegance, a forceful style of expression. Worthy of the great bard, Shakespeare. Her unforgettable utterance breathed orchid sweetness. Her thoughts showed true distinction. Then the sad song of parting was sung, and the plaintive lament of the ship's horn sounded. Secret traces of tears were wiped away. After we had parted, a coloured note conveyed your words. You had given birth to a daughter, a radiant pearl in the hand. I sent a gift bearing afar my heart's inner message. Time passed. Again the river plums bloomed. Once more the spring wind blew. And men contended for another glimpse of the fairy beauty, fine as a flower, now a beautiful wife, a lifetime companion. We held another joyful gathering as of old. Ah, how the wine entered her very entrails, lighting a glow in the shallow pools of her jade dimples. I was long a drifter in solitude, a phoenix floating, a lone bird fluttering, sighing at my lone shadow, my wretched fate. I yearned to don a monk's robe, to sit on the meditation mat, to worship in the temple. I was not destined to touch such beauty, to fondle those tresses. Not destined, no, not in this life. On whom can I depend to convey my message? The wheel of the moon is my heart's burden. My grief finds words in this lyric form, this Orioles Lament. Golden memories of joys past are all consigned to a bitter void. Paradise lies far beyond the clouds. I gaze at the twinkling stars of the Milky Way, alone with my pure feelings. I find myself, even today, after all these years, strangely moved by this poem. And I give it to you as a most eccentric example of modern Chinese poetry, because this could have been written in the Song dynasty, you know. And yet, it's terribly modern. It's about a moment in his life in Shanghai, you know, when he was just clearly madly in love. And yet, he's able to see it, even then in the 1930s, through the eyes of the poet, you know. So I think it's a far better poem than Su Zhimo would have written on the subject, you know. He's using an antique mode of expression, but he's using it completely right. There's nothing false about it. It's absolutely authentic poetry. And for that reason, I'm very happy to give it to you in this lecture on modern Chinese poetry. Even though many people would think I'm crazy to do so, I think it's a wonderful example of the poetic spirit alive in the 1930s. Now, I want to end, not with this, but with finally with another poem of PK's, because I feel this is where Mr. Sung had all his poems engraved on his grave in Taiwan, on Yangmingshan. So they're right there on black granite. I want to end with a poem by PK, because I feel this is very appropriate to our gathering here, because as you all know, the first stop on bus number, whatever it is, on the way to Diamond Hill, is this Zhilian Jingyuan, you know, the nunnery, the Buddhist nunnery. I'm sure you've all been there. I go there as often as I can. It's a wonderful place. And PK used to like it very much. He took me there several times because he also liked the dim sum, made by the nuns behind the waterfall. It's beautiful food, very pure. And the garden's lovely, and the temple is beautiful too. Anyway, he wrote this poem about it, and this is the Chinese version, which I happen to have on my computer, so I was able to put that up. And I've been working on a translation, but it's very much a work in progress. So I give it to you not as a finished translation, but as a draft, a work in progress. I like this translation. I like the poem very much. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about my translation, but it's just a work in progress. So I like to end with this, partly because it's so close to home. It's just on the other side of Tate's Cairn Tunnel. Dalao Shan. You just go through the tunnel, and there it is. And what I love about it is that there it is on the left, and on the right is Hollywood Plaza. You couldn't have two more contrasting things. On the right is the red dust, the Hongchan of Hollywood Plaza, and on the left is this amazing little enclave of peace and quiet. And even with the tourists, I went there just the other day. It's still a wonderful place to go to. Wonderful lotuses in the ponds, all different colors, and fish, and it's just magical place, and it represents, the timeless world of Buddhist meditation as well. Anyway, it takes time to fathom history, to bring it into the light. This juniper wood from America, because the whole temple's built out of wood, this juniper wood from America, newly clad in the brown robes of the Tang dynasty, quietly breathing and alive, its skin parched and slightly blotched, and the Buddha within, forged in Japan, sitting calmly on his throne, settling. Lost mineral pigments brought home from foreign lands, half-hidden faces delicately sketched, gazing joyously at this recreated antique. Because the temple is a perfect recreation of a Tang dynasty temple. The brutish skyscrapers. If you go there, you look at the temple, and then up above it, these massive great skyscrapers, the brutish skyscrapers way down behind us as we throw open the monastery gate and see the red dust of the highways. And beyond it, the hill of the compassionate cloud, blending with the diamond and the lion. You see, you've got Diamond Hill and Lion Rock, It's a very local poem, very Hong Kong poem. One of PK's most sort of localized poems. On this tiny plot of land, they built a sanctuary, planted vegetables, instructed a few simple souls to dig a deep pond, plant lotus pods saved from calamity, wait each day for their soft leaves to unfurl. Out of the murk comes a first inkling, a need for clarity. So now he's turning this into a more metaphysical, philosophical reflection, you see. Out of the murk, as the whole Buddhist metaphor of the lotus growing out of the mud, a first inkling of enlightenment, you see, a need for clarity. The body of mud and dust gradually forms a lotus heart, a will to give life new order, to raise the young, care for the sick, the elderly, the lonely, the poor. The matin bell wakes the birds from their chaotic dreams. In the dignity of a single lotus seed, it can all be seen as it is, the main beam upright, the lattices open wide, the harmony of the gently slanting eaves. The Buddha sits there in peace, while the workmen take their afternoon break in the cloister, in the cool breeze shared with the cries of every insect in the world. A single lotus petal ties it all together, each form, every phenomenon. The stone lotus stands there firm and upright. The roof ridge with its celestial birds brings waves of peace. Lotus stalks raise aloft the altar, unfurl the prayers. Lotus leaves are tiles on the roof, leading to ever greater beauty. Now, this was written in March 1999. And of course, one of the interesting things about it is that it brings back the theme of the lotus, which was one that obsessed PK in the 1980s. The lotus, again, as a symbol of inner peace. Now, PK was he wasn't a Buddhist monk, He loved life, He loved to drink, he liked to play, he liked to travel. He was always enjoying life every day. But deep inside him, he had this very poetic sense, which in fact I would like to compare with the great 18th century Qing poet Nalan Qingde, about being a monk, but without having cut his hair off. He was a monk who still couldn't achieve enlightenment because of the one word Qing, because of his unstoppable feeling for life. This is very much PK as a great Chinese poet, writing in the modern world, in Hong Kong. And I still believe quite firmly that he and Mu Dan are the two great modern Chinese poets, and both of them worthy of careful translation and introduction to a Western readership. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
I'm afraid this is more about poetry than translation. I have heard people from other places criticize Hong Kong as a place that can cultivate poetry because it's too busy, too crowded. So I wanted to know what you think about it, and if you know of any contemporary poet whom you hold in high regard.
Thank you. Good question. I mean, I first came to Hong Kong in 1966. It's a very long time ago. And I came here as a student. And I've lived and taught in Hong Kong for more than 15 years. So I'm very familiar with Hong Kong. And I come back this time and I find myself enormously attracted to Hong Kong, despite everything that's happening. I feel enormous attachment to Hong Kong, a great love of the place. And your perception is a very common one, but it's completely wrong. I mean, Hong Kong has been a culturally rich place. Not you, other people, okay. Yeah, okay. Sorry, okay. The perception which you are putting forward is, of course, completely wrong. Hong Kong is a most wonderfully bewildering place because, yes, it's a commercial and financial center. You get down on the bus to go to Central, and it's just like a massive crowd of people. But, the funny thing is, even on that level, the people here, I find the people here very considerate. People here, they see an old man with a stick, they stand up and give me a seat. They don't do that in Australia, I can promise you. And I mean, it is a place that has hidden depths, right? Hidden depths. And an incredible tenderness of heart as well, which is something I really appreciate. A great belief in certain traditional values, despite all the money, all the business, and so on. And I don't know whose views you're actually presenting, but if you compare them with the mainland Chinese cultural authorities, I remember before the great handover, the Hui Gui, a group of officials from China came to talk to Hong Kong intellectuals. And they said, you can rest calm, we will not change Hong Kong culture, You will continue to have horse racing, you will continue to have prostitution. That's what they thought was Hong Kong culture, right? So everybody has the wrong idea. Hong Kong poetry goes back a long way. Hong Kong, there's a wonderful tradition of fiction as well. One of the greatest novels written in Chinese this century was written in Hong Kong in the 1960s by Liu Yichang called Jiu Tu. It's literally, I'm editing a translation right now. It could never have been written in the mainland. It uses James Joyce's kind of stream of consciousness technique. It's a brilliant novel. And some of the finest movies. I mean, Hong Kong is a great center for cinema. Some of the great calligraphers, great painters, and so on. I mean, I wish I could do something to dispel this misunderstanding because it's for me, very sad. Of course, Hong Kong is an amazingly vibrant economically and financially. So is New York, for goodness sake, I mean, and yet New York is a cultural center and produces the most amazing, diverse cultural activities, in New York. And even, something like Paris, is also a bustling centre of fashion and but something that's always struck me about Hong Kong from the very first time I came there is this incredible combination of a glittering exterior and a very tender interior, And it's very evident in the poetry of Ye Si, Ya Si. I mean, his soul is so tender, and yet he captures the external details with brilliant precision. But underneath it all is this questioning, loving, tender soul. And that's the essence of poetry, of course. I mean, going right the way back to Keats and Shelley, and it's present here too. And there are dozens of poets working in Hong Kong, to this day. And very clever young people who have great sensitivity, who, I've taught many generations, well, not really generations, but many students here. And I mean, they are wonderful people. And Hong Kong is a very rich and diverse place, even to this day. And I'm actually editing a series of 6 books this year of Hong Kong literature in translation, which was originally a plan of mine and PK's together. Then he went and died on me. But I mean, I'm doing it for his memory. And partly to dispel this misunderstanding, because, and if you want somebody else to support my argument, which you probably don't, but I mean, I suggest you get in touch with Professor Liu Li at Chinese University, Liu Fan. He's also become a great Hong Kong, although he's not originally from Hong Kong, He was educated in Taiwan and America, but he's ended up living in Hong Kong. And he too has this similar perception of Hong Kong, It's a unique place. It's incredibly important. And in addition to the modern Hong Kong diversity that I've been talking about, if you go back further, before the British colony, if you go back to Cantonese culture, if you go back to the poetry written in Guangzhou, amazing poetry. But always the Northerners like to put it down because, the Cantonese are rather, they regard them with a certain degree of contempt, It's always been the way. This is typical Northern attitude, So the Northerners don't like to praise Hong Kong. I mean, PK was always having trouble with the Northern officials, because they didn't regard Cantonese as a proper language, anything. And it is a misperception that I'm really sad about, and I want to try and do my little bit to try and improve it by editing these 6 books, all produced in Hong Kong. Hopefully you can read them, and have some fun with them, because it's understandable what you've been telling me about, but it's also a very sad misperception of the truth. Anyone got anything else to say?
Hi, Professor Minford. Just now when we were talking about the poem 古镇之梦, you mentioned the distinguishing between the use of de and a. How would you personally translate it, and what's your rationale behind it?
If there's one thing I can't tell you, it's how to distinguish between the indefinite article and the definite article. It's like saying, how do you cook carrots? I mean, I can always tell you what I think is the right way. I'm always doing it to my students' work. No, definite. But I mean, I can never explain it. It's part of the essential structure of Romance languages. And each language is slightly different. But I mean, the English language has its peculiarities, and the use of the definite article and the indefinite article is one of the great peculiarities of the English language. All I can say is read more and speak more, and you'll know. It'll be in your bones. Okay, I can't explain it. And in that particular case, I wouldn't use the definite article. I would personally use, I might use a mixture of definite and indefinite, but I probably wouldn't use the word village either. So, I mean, I don't think a zhen is really a village, It's a special kind of village, So I would, but I mean, I don't do translations off the cuff, So I can't answer your question like that. But just read more, You'll find it becomes second nature to you in the end. I can't explain why. but it just is one of those things, you know. Sorry not to be able to be better at my life. Oh yes, gentleman here.
Thank you, John. I have a question about the poems you shared with us. It's from The Fragrant Hermitage that you have translated. I'm wondering why the lines in the poem is arranged in a special way.
Okay.
Why do they look like that?
Yeah,
in terms of the layout. Thank you.
I'm happy to answer that question. You know, I've worked a lot with Ci poetry in my life. The very first thing I ever published in 1979 was a translation of an essay on Ci poetry. And so I've thought a lot about how to translate Ci poetry. And you know, one of the earliest definitions of Ci poetry was that it was poetry in short and long lines, you know, 长短句, you know. And every Ci pai has its structure of different line lengths, you know, 3, 5, 7, 5, 4, 3, 2. And that's one of the characteristics of Ci poetry. Whereas, you know, Liu Shi has to be either equal lines of 5 syllables or 7, you know, very grid-like. And the whole point of Ci poetry is that it's based on a musical meter which has different line lengths. Now, it's also very lyrical and melodic. And one of the devices one can use in English to try to reflect that, but it has to be used with great care, is to vary line lengths and to try and create a sense of rhythmic fluidity through the way because we can use typography, you see. Chinese doesn't really use that, you know. If you look at a typical old Chinese book of poetry, it's just vertical lines, you know, it doesn't even have punctuation. But in English, we can play around with starting a sentence slightly indented, starting and varying the shape of the typographical layout of the poem. It's a very important tool we have to try to create this sense of rhythmical fluidity, you see. That's why I always use that quite a lot in Ci poetry. It's a sort of way of substituting something to be the equivalent of this long and short lines, you know. So I find it quite successful. What do you think? You don't like it, perhaps? Do you find it upsetting in some way? You find it interesting, okay. Interesting is a very good word. The French always say, very spécial, very special. That means they won't tell you that they don't like it. You don't have to agree with me at all. I'm always happy when people don't agree with me. It's boring when they always agree with you. But I've tried to explain why I do it that way anyway. All I can say is that the son was very happy with it. And the father was quite happy too. And that, for me, that's important. I like to satisfy my customers, you know.
Professor Minford,
yes,
I like you to comment more about the Taiwanese poet like Yu Guangzhong you mentioned, Zheng Qiuyu and Yang Mu, for example. You mentioned about topic is dancing in chains, right? They probably are not dancing in chains because probably when they were under Chiang Kai-shek they still dancing in chains, but after that they are probably more free, right?
I see what you mean, yes, chains, yeah. Well, look, first of all, I'm a great admirer of Taiwan poetry. I think it's wonderful. Of course, everyone knows Yu Guangzhong because he lived in Hong Kong for so long. But many of the Yang Mu, for example, wrote some wonderful poetry, and some of the younger poets as well. They've been so unfortunately neglected in the world. Then so is everything else about Taiwan. You know, let's not even get onto that topic. You know, it's too sad. But I mean, there has been a wonderful tradition of good poetic writing in Taiwan, and Yu Guangzhong is of course the most famous of them all. He is a real craftsman, you know, in his use of language, in his lack of sentimentality, in his sense of humor, his control. He's a kind of neoclassicist in a way, and I admire him for that enormously. if I had another lifetime, and I won't, but I mean, if I did have another lifetime, I would probably spend a lot of it working with Taiwanese poets, because I just think, luckily there's a very fine translator called John Balcom, who has specialized all his life. He teaches in Monterey, and he's a very fine translator, and he's specialized in translating Taiwanese poetry very, very well. And yes, they never really were in much trouble. I mean, during the Chiang Kai-shek era, it was mainly the writers of fiction who got into trouble, like Chen Yingzhen, he got into trouble. But I mean, on the whole, and certainly since 1986, the environment in Taiwan has been extremely open and free. And just the problem is, they've always been relegated to the margins because of the huge pressure from the mainland, So people don't, on the whole, treat them with sufficient respect, I think. It'd be a wonderful day when a writer from Taiwan gets given the Nobel Prize. I really hope that happens. Not that I care about the Nobel Prize, but I would just like to see Taiwan given the kind of recognition. I mean, I think there's beginning to be more respect for Taiwanese filmmakers, people like Ho Xiaoxian. They're given, because ever since the success of Li An, Li An, of course, was from Taiwan. But I mean, in the film world, they seem to have made some progress in terms of international recognition. But in terms of translation, it's a very slow process. And of course, Bai Xianyong is a very good example of someone who's managed to break through to a certain extent, but still a very limited extent. His work is gradually becoming more... He's a very fine writer, of course, a very fine stylist. But I think the poetry will eventually be recognized for what it is, which is extremely good. Extremely good, yeah. Not a very good answer to your question, I'm afraid. I think that's probably more or less it, I think. So let's just call it a day, shall we? Thank you very, very much for coming.